What kind of father is that? If you're going to make children so close to the ground, why have you put fathers up so high? He won't be able to shoot marbles without kneeling, tuck a child in bed without bending, or even kiss a child without a lot of stooping. And God smiled and said, yes, but if I make him child-size, who will children have to look up to? And when God made a father's hands, they were large and sinewy. And the angel shook her head sadly and said, do you know what you're doing? Large hands are clumsy. They can't manage diaper pins, small buttons, rubber bands on ponytails, or even remove splinters caused by baseball bats. And God smiled and said, I know. But they're large enough to hold everything a small boy empties from his pockets at the end of a day, yet small enough to cup a child's face in his hands. And then God molded long, slim legs and broad shoulders, and the angel nearly had a heart attack. Boy, this is the end of the week, all right, she clucked. Do you realize you just made a father without a lap? He is going to pull a child close to him without the kid falling between his legs. And God smiled and said, a mother needs a lap. A father needs strong shoulders to pull a sled, balance a boy on a bicycle, and hold a sleepy head on the way home from the circus. God was in the middle of creating two of the largest feet anyone had ever seen when the angel could contain herself no longer. That's not fair. Do you honestly think those large boats are going to dig out of bed early in the morning when the baby cries, or walk through a small birthday party without crushing at least 3 of the guests? And God smiled and said, they'll work. You'll see. They'll support a small child who wants to ride a horse to Banbury Cross, or scare off mice at the summer cabin, or display shoes that will be a challenge to fill. God worked throughout the night, giving the father few words, but a firm, authoritative voice, eyes that saw everything but remained calm and tolerant. Finally, almost as an afterthought, he added tears. Then he turned to the angel and said, now are you satisfied that he can love as much as a mother? The angel shutteth up. Well, I'm not sure Irma Bombeck's theology was 100% accurate in that little piece, but I hope it brought a smile to your lips and perhaps a tear to your eye. I want to talk with you this morning, since it's Father's Day, about Paul's instructions to fathers. His instructions are found in 2 parallel passages. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, Paul said, and you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. And then in the parallel passage in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 21, Paul said, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. I'm going to be talking primarily to fathers this morning, but that doesn't mean that the mothers in our assembly can go to sleep and take a nap. Because pretty much everything that I will say to fathers will have application to mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers, and I suspect that if you are none of those things, you can still find a way to apply this sermon to your life. I want to begin by pointing out that Paul's instructions to fathers are expressed both negatively and positively. Negatively, Paul says, there's something that you shouldn't do. Do not provoke your children to wrath. But then positively, Paul said, fathers, bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. His instructions are rendered somewhat differently in the various English versions that you see on the screen. But the idea is that fathers must not make their children angry unnecessarily. They must not cause their children to react and respond in the wrong way. They must not irritate or embitter their children. Fathers must not exasperate their children. Frankly, I believe that Paul may very well have given this command because it's all too easy for fathers to do this very thing. We can so easily get caught up in our own lives and our own jobs and our recreation and all of the things that consume our thoughts and our time that it's easy for us to forget our responsibilities to our kids. Now, before I go further, lest I be misunderstood, Paul is not saying in these passages that if your child ever gets angry with you, that you have automatically and necessarily failed as a father. That's not what Paul is saying. That's not what he means. He says that fathers should not provoke their children. Sometimes, dads, when you do your job well, your kids will not like that. And your kids may very well get angry with you. They might even say things like, well, I hate you and I never want to see you again. Teenagers are prone to say things like that sometimes. But that is the child choosing anger without provocation from the father. And may I say to you that that kind of disrespectful response is a direct violation of what Paul teaches in the opening verses of Ephesians chapter 6, when he instructs children to obey their parents and honor father and mother. And listen to me carefully, moms and dads, that kind of respectful response must not be left unaddressed. But we need to ask ourselves the question, how can a father provoke his children to wrath? Well, I would submit to you that you can do that pretty much in the same way that you might provoke anybody to wrath. But let me suggest some ways that fathers can wrongly provoke their children to anger. You can do that by improper discipline. And there's many different ways that our discipline can be improper in the home. It can be improper if it is neglected. In fact, the Bible teaches that the father and mother who neglect to discipline their children hate their children. Now, if you find that language strong, if you doubt that the Bible actually says something like that, turn in your Old Testaments to Proverbs the 13th chapter and the 24th verse, where the wise man says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. The parent who says, well, I love little Johnny too much to spank him, according to this passage, really hates his son. Years ago, I had a father argue with me about this passage in a Bible class, probably close to 40 years ago or so, and I still remembered that brief discussion, but let me say to you, fathers, if you want to argue about this, you're arguing with inspired Scripture. This is what that verse says. All too often, when parents fail to give their children the discipline that they need, it's not really the child that they love when they say, well, I just love little Johnny too much to spank him. It's not Johnny that they love, it's themselves. They don't want to hurt themselves. They don't want to make the emotional investment. They don't want to take the time. They don't want the hassle. They don't want to be bothered. All too often, moms and dads who neglect to discipline their children do so not because they're thinking about their children, but rather they're thinking about themselves. And then, of course, discipline is improper if it is harsh, needlessly harsh. Needless and petty restrictions discourage children. We've all heard that old adage, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. In the Christian's home, it should never be the case for bitter words, sarcasm, ridicule, humiliation, or cruel actions. A father is to have compassion on his children. The psalmist says in Psalm 103, verse 13, as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. I remember Sister Kenita Hall saying many, many years ago that when her husband Sewell was just a small boy and he did something wrong and needed a switching, that his mother would hold her arm down next to his little legs and switch his little legs and her arm to be sure that she didn't go too far. To be sure that the discipline wasn't overly harsh. Discipline is also improper if it's just an outlet for us to vent our own anger. Many years ago, my parents attended a business convention. I think it was in Chicago, if I remember correctly. And they heard a public speaker by the name of Tony Campolo give an address, and he was talking about the family in that address. And one of the points that he made is that parents should never discipline their children in anger. I forgot to tell you that Mr. Campolo was also a sociologist and a college professor, and he had talked to one of his classes about parents not disciplining their kids in anger. And one of his students went home and came back the next day having composed this poem. And Campolo shared the poem in his address. I listened to a recording of that, and here's the poem. It was entitled, Never Strike a Child in Anger. Never strike a child in anger. Never hit him when irate. Save it for some happy time when both are feeling great. Save it for some happy bedtime, and as you tuck him in his crib, clench your fist and let him have it, or better choke him with his bib. Wait until a Sunday morning and try to catch him at his prayers, and as he whispers, God bless Dada, kick him neatly down the stairs. Or how about a birthday party when friends and laughter fill the house? Then bash him with the cake you've lettered, greetings to the little louse. Although he breaks your Wedgwood china and spills your coffee on the floor, never strike a child in anger. It's not civilized anymore. It makes a child feel insecure when parents strike or shove, but you can do him in completely as long as it's done in love. Well, now I found that poem funny, but Campolo was right. Parents should never discipline their children in anger. Discipline is also improper if it is inconsistent. When our children do something that's funny today and wrong tomorrow, that's a problem. We discipline our kids inconsistently when we punish them for certain behavior in front of the preacher that we let go at any other time. We discipline them inconsistently when we punish them for doing something that we taught them to do, like cursing or drinking or smoking. When one of Brother L.V. Tucker's sons was caught smoking, he was asked by someone what he was going to do about that, and he said, or rather he was asked if he was going to punish his boy. He said, "No, I've smoked in front of him." And whereupon Brother Tucker quit smoking for 17 years. Sadly, later on in his life, he went back to smoking. I don't know why. But that was a father who had a wise perception of the situation. He had set the wrong example. He, by his example, had taught his son to smoke, and so he wasn't going to punish him for something that he had taught him to do. Discipline is also improper if it is ineffective, a slap on the wrist. Remember what the Lord said to Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 13. Or rather, the Lord is speaking to Samuel about Eli. "For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them." Moms and dads, if your disciplinary methods are not working, you need to find another method that will work. I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. I think I was probably in about the 6th grade. I was taking a shower one night. We had a shower stall that didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, and my brother Alan snuck in and he poured cold water over the top of the shower stall all over me, and I said, "When I get out of here, I'm going to slug you." My brother hollered into my dad, and my dad said, "Kevin, if you hit him, I'm going to spank you." Well, I thought about it. And I thought about it. And I decided it was worth it. And so I slugged him. Now, I didn't hit him in the stomach, or I didn't hit him in the face. I think I hit him in the arm. But when we came out of the bathroom, my dad looked at me and he says, "Well, Kevin, I'm not going to spank you." He said, "Obviously, it wouldn't do any good. And so for the next 2 weeks, you're going to go to bed at 8 o'clock and you can't touch a basketball." You see, I didn't know moms and dads could change the rules in the middle of the game. But my dad was a wise father. I think back on that incident with a great deal of chagrin, because I flopped my big hairy toe across a line that my dad had drawn. And that was wrong. That was sinful. I didn't realize for decades how wrong that was, how sinful that was. And I'm ashamed of what I did. because I rebelled against my father. But my dad was wise enough to realize spanking wasn't going to work. And so he had to do something else. And so I say to moms and dads, if your disciplinary measures are not effective, if they're not accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, then you've got to change your method. You've got to find something else that will work. We can provoke our children to wrath by negativity. There's got to be a balance between reward and punishment. We've got to do more than punish wrong behavior. We've got to reinforce right behavior. And if we always expect our kids to mess it up every time and do it all wrong, we're going to provoke them to anger. We must never leave the impression in the minds of our children that we think they can never do anything right. Our kids need to feel good about doing right. And if we always rain on their parade, they'll become discouraged. Overprotection is another way that we can provoke our children to wrath. Moms and dads can be so fearful that harm may befall their little darling that they fence them in from every direction. Don't do this, don't do that, don't go here, don't go there, you might get hurt. Don't go in the water till you learn to swim. We can act like that sometimes, can't we? Certainly our kids need to be warned of great dangers, but on the other hand, a little bit of risk-taking is necessary for their physical, moral, and spiritual development. If the little bird remains in the safety of the nest, it will never learn to fly. We've got to allow our kids to get out of the nest and fly and take some risks. This kind of overprotective attitude has a tendency of depriving our children of the confidence that they need, and it can instill resentment and anger within them. We can provoke our children to wrath by hypocrisy. Our kids will be far more influenced by what they see us do than by what they hear us say. There was an adage in ancient Israel, and Ezekiel mentions it in Ezekiel 16:44, like mother, like daughter. We have a form of that today, don't we? Like father, like son. Our kids imitate their parents. And that means that it is imperative for us to set a good example before them. Favoritism is another way that we can provoke our children to wrath. Sometimes parents show favoritism because of the sex of the child. He's a boy rather than a girl, or vice versa. Because of the physical attractiveness of the child, or the intellectual ability of the child, or the physical abilities of the child. Maybe we show partiality because of the mother or the father of the child, if we're talking about a second marriage. We can also show partiality to children who have some kind of mental or physical handicap. But partiality will exasperate children. It caused trouble in Isaac's household, didn't it? Because Isaac was partial to Esau, Esau was a man's man. He was a hunter, a gatherer, and Rebekah favored Jacob. Partiality was at least partly responsible for the difficulties in Jacob's family as he showed favoritism to Jacob. We've got to realize that every child is a unique individual. And he must be loved by his parents because God made him in the image of God and because they brought him into the world. Unfairness is another way that we can provoke our children to wrath. It's unfair to have unrealistic expectations of our children, expecting a man's head on a boy's shoulders. We need to remember that boys will be boys. Of course, somebody said they don't have to be the James boys, and there's some truth in that. Expecting one child to be like another. Expecting a son to be a carbon copy of his father. It's unfair if we do not clearly explain our expectations to our children and then punish them when they fall short. And if you can't read their minds, and have you noticed that you can't? That you can't read the minds of your kids? Well, they can't read your minds either. And then we can provoke our children to wrath through indifference and neglect. I fear that many parents today, in an effort to give their kids all of the things that they didn't have when they were kids, have wound up not giving them the things that they did have that are so important. We have failed to give them our love. We have failed to give them our time. Brother David Ramey is a math teacher in Pike County, Kentucky. And I've held a few gospel meetings in the congregation where he attends. And he said many years ago that a teenager told him that she had been trying to get pregnant for 2 years. And when he asked her why, she replied, "I want someone to love me." Now stop and think about that for a moment. Here's a teenage girl so deprived and so desperate for love that she wanted to get pregnant so she could have a baby that would love her. That is tragically sad. We have failed to give our children our time. One study has suggested that the average father spends 1 minute per day with a child under the age of 6. Charles Francis Adams was a 19th century political figure, a diplomat, and he kept a diary. And one day he entered these words, "Went fishing with my son today, a day wasted." Interestingly enough, his son, Brooke Adams, also kept a diary. And he made an entry on that same day in his diary that read, "Went fishing with my father, the most wonderful day of my life." In the quarrel between David and his son Absalom, was the fault entirely on Absalom's side? Wasn't David also partly responsible because he neglected his son? Broken promises is another way that we can provoke our children to wrath. And then impenitence. The refusal to admit when you've done wrong, when you've sinned against your child, when you've made mistakes. Warren Wiersbe, in his comment on the passage in Ephesians, says, "Fathers provoke their children and discourage them by saying one thing and doing another, by always blaming and never praising, by being inconsistent and unfair in discipline, and by showing favoritism in the home, by making promises and not keeping them, and by making light of problems that to the children are very important. Many years ago, Ken Green said in a sermon, puppy love is real to the puppies. And I've always remembered that. Well, we must move along because Paul also says, bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. And the idea is that we must bring up our children to maturity. That's the idea in this word that Paul uses here, to nourish up to maturity. That should be the goal of fathers, to produce maturity in their children. And what you do every day should be focused towards that end and that goal. The way you interact with them, the experiences that you provide for them, the way you discipline them, all of that needs to take them toward the goal of maturity. In Luke chapter 2, Luke briefly talked about the maturing process in the life of our Lord. He says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. In other words, Jesus matured intellectually, physically, spiritually, and socially. And fathers need to train their children and bring them to maturity in each one of these areas. Certainly, you need to help your kids mature intellectually. You need to help them learn the things that they need to learn to live a successful life in this world. You need to help them with their homework. I had trouble with algebra. And I remember staying up late with my dad helping me do my algebra homework. I'll never forget that. And Daddy was able and willing to do that after he'd worked a long, hard day. You need to help your kids mature physically. They need proper nourishment and exercise so that their bodies can grow strong. But let's face it, to a great extent, physical maturity will happen with little help from us. You need to help your kids mature socially. They need to learn how to get along with their siblings. They need to be taught to share their toys. You need to help them deal with bullies at school. You need to teach them how to treat girls and boys, as the case may be. You need to teach them to respect their teachers. But above everything else, you need to help your children mature spiritually. And that kind of maturity does not happen naturally. And I fear that all too often fathers neglect this responsibility. They teach their kids how to make a living, but not how to make a life that pleases God. They teach their kids to love sports and recreation and pleasure, but not how to love God and His Word. But to teach your kids to love God and love His Word, you've got to show them that you love Him deeply and fervently and passionately. Hypocrisy and apathy will not do that. Sadly, too many parents expect the church or the preacher or the Bible class teacher to take care of this. Many years ago, there was a mother lamenting the fact that none of her kids were interested in spiritual things. And she said, I don't know what happened. We took our kids to church all the time. And I didn't say it, but I thought to myself, if that's all you did, that's not enough. The preacher and the Bible class teacher will not stand before God and give an account for raising your kids. You will. When the Supreme Court handed down its ruling against required prayer in the public schools, a famous editorial cartoonist published a cartoon in the Washington Post showing a picture of an angry father waving a newspaper at his family and shouting, "What do they expect of us? Or what do they expect us to do? Listen to the kids pray at home?" And the answer is yes. Home is the place to teach your kids. Home is the place for your kids to learn about God and the Christian life. And we can't pass the buck to the preacher or the elders or the Bible class teachers. Man, your goal as a father should not be just to make it through another day. It should not be just to provide your kids with all the pleasure and the entertainment that their little hearts might want, to give them all the toys that you didn't have. You should measure your success as a parent by whether or not your children are becoming increasingly mature. Unfortunately, too many parents measure their success based on whether the kids are having a good time or not. And as a consequence, we have raised a generation of young adults who do not behave responsibly. Rather, they act based upon their feelings and their pleasures. Maturity should be the goal for our kids, not happiness or pleasure. Paul goes on to say that fathers are to train their children in the Lord. The words training and admonition are somewhat interchangeable. Both of the terms deal with the training of children. But some who have studied the original language say that the first term is about training by action, and the second term emphasizes training with words. And that is certainly true. We must train our kids by our actions and by our words. Actions alone without words will not work. Words alone without actions will not work. Evidently, Abraham knew that. God said of him in Genesis 18:19, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." Abraham commanded his children to obey and serve the Lord, but he did more than that. He showed them the right example. He lived the kind of life before them, not perfectly, but nonetheless, he lived the kind of life before them that he wanted his children to live. Our training must be in the Lord. We can train by setting the right example. We can train by chastening or punishment. We can train by allowing our children to face the natural consequences of their own actions. In the old Andy Griffith show, Andy made Opie pay for a window he broke. We've got to teach our kids to be responsible, to clean up their messes, to take care of things when they've broken something. We train our kids by practicing good behavior before them. And a child who is old enough to walk can be quickly trained to come when you say, "Come here." Many years ago, I heard Brother Art Ogden preach in a gospel meeting, and he confessed in that sermon that when his oldest daughter, Vicky, was quite young, they were having all kinds of trouble with her. And Brother Ogden said it was a single preacher who pointed out to him that they didn't have control of Vicky. And he suggested that when he told Vicky to come, if she didn't come, he needed to explain in detail. You were supposed to smile. Why she should come when Daddy said come. Well, Art decided that they needed to get a hold of their oldest daughter, and so he waited till she did something that she shouldn't have done, and he spanked her. And he told her, "Now when Daddy says come, you need to come." And he let her go, and she walked across the room, and he said, "Come here," and she didn't come. And he grabbed her, and he wore her out again. And he said, "We never had any trouble with Vicky after that." You see, he got control. Well, I'm going to exercise mercy. I'm out of time. Kathy is thankful. Every father needs to give serious thought to Paul's instructions to fathers. Let me tell you, dads, if you've not made the decision to follow Jesus, you can't be the best possible parent to your kids. Because you're not setting the right example in the most important area of life. Parents need to be Christians. But more than that, they need to be faithful, dedicated, serious Christians if they want to bring up their children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. So I ask you this morning, dads, how are you doing? Is there room for improvement? Are there things that you could do differently, things that you could do better? Let me close with the words of Solomon in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 1, when he says, "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of her mother." I hope this lesson will be helpful I hope that you'll think about the things that we've said. If your life's not right with the Lord, we urge you to get right with Him. We give you an opportunity to do that right now as we stand and we sing.